All right, we are going to talk about perhaps the first genre of art, folklore, myth, and legend. And folklore, myth, and legend is squishing together a bunch of things, I understand, but they all inhabit that category of our first attempts as humans to explain our world and our society. So they were often told by storytellers, so they were not written at first, and many have no original author. They may say things like told by or retold by, but usually these stories have origins so far back that no one knows who told them first. They usually give an origin or a start of something. They explain the natural world, such as earthquakes or day and night. They sometimes help, or they often create the worldview of a group of people. So they explain how this group of people sees the world through their creation stories or their morality tales or things like that. Stories are based on famous figures, places, or events, but exaggerated. Those would be your legends. So this person that they're telling the story about may have existed, but they may not have been as strong or fast or powerful or smart as the story makes them out to be. So that would be your legends. Heroes, gods, or animals that are in these stories have human qualities. So frequently, even if they're talking about a god, the god, or it was one of many gods and goddesses, will behave like humans, like have our qualities good and bad. And then often there is a lesson or moral to be learned from the folklore, myth, or legend. Those that are very clearly spelled out are either allegory or fable, which is a type of folklore. So folklore, myth, and legend, there you go. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the setting of folklore, myth, and legend. And what is important to remember is that these stories will be told about towns and places and the villages and the forests and the terrain, perhaps even the lakes or rivers or oceans that are familiar to the people. So the places are going to be familiar because these stories tell about a particular culture. They tell about a particular place in the world. And generally stem from a time when people didn't travel that far from home. The time for folklore, myth, and legend I like to think of as once upon a time, which is our favorite fairy tale beginning. And again, fairy tales do fall into the folklore category. Or that's how you can think about this. Time is usually in the past of whatever culture is telling this, because it's something that they've experienced and learned from. A long time ago is also a favorite way of thinking about the time in folklore, myth, and legend. Remember, fairy tales that we don't know who the author is. They've been told and retold as oral tradition, stories out loud by storytellers, that we don't know who originally created it. That is the difference between a fairy tale and then a fantasy story that has a particular author and is written at a particular time. So there's a big difference there. The setting or the social expectations of setting is that it's familiar to people. Again, the social behavior that's going on in the story has to be familiar to the culture or the people that are listening to the story. Otherwise, it's not going to make sense to them, and it won't teach that moral or lesson that the storyteller intended. So the characters in folklore, myth, and legend, both the protagonist and the antagonist, tend to follow certain kinds of types. The protagonist tends to be a hero. The protagonist could also be a god or goddess, or a demigod, like a half god or goddess, or even an animal with human qualities. So the main character might be a hero, they could be a god or a goddess, or an animal with human qualities. This is also the case for the antagonist. They could be just your straight up bad guy, so a hero that just sees the world differently or doesn't wants to fight the main character, so that they get their way instead of the hero getting their way. Gods and goddesses are frequent antagonists. And again, if you're talking about like a fable, animals with human qualities could be that antagonist as well. Or even the myths like the Minotaur or something like that. Supporting characters could be heroes, goddesses, animals with human qualities. I did forget to add royalty. Kings get it especially bad in certain kinds of myth and legends. But I suppose they could fall under heroes. Supporting characters would be animals with human qualities. Magic. Magic is frequently a supporting character of some kind, either a magic person or like a magic amulet or a magic potion, and special objects. So they might get a special sword or a magic harp or magic shoes. These are all things that are definitely noted in either a myth or a fairy tale. So think about it. Something unusual behaves in a magical way. It's probably a fairy tale, which is a part of folklore. Okay, plot and events for folklore, myth, and legend have, I think, one bigger plot structure and then could eventually evolve into other ways of telling the story, of structuring the story. The first one that is very important in myth and legend is the hero's journey. So the man that kind of explained or studied, research, writes about the hero's journey, his name is Joseph Campbell. His book is called The Hero with a Thousand Faces. And he compared the folklore, the myth, legends across cultures, across world cultures, and they all follow, in his mind, and arguably, this pattern of the hero's journey where there's someone at home, they're minding their own business, an adventure calls to them, something happens that requires them to like leave their home. They may not want to go, they still have to go. They meet mentors, they meet companions, they suffer trials, they might have losses, they eventually make the journey, get the girl, find the object, solve the problem, whatever it is, and then they return home to where they started with this new knowledge or new experience, and might even start a new adventure. So for folklore, myth, and legend, the hero's journey is by far, I think, the most important structure to think about, as well as just that, what I always call BME, beginning, middle, and end. So a story might just have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and all of the important stuff happens at the end. But you need all of the information that you've heard to get to that moral or nugget. So think about a fable. When you think when you read the fables, like there's something happens at the beginning, there's some stuff in the middle, but in the end, that's when they learn their lesson. So that is also a structure you might find. Another one, because folklore, myth, and legends have been told and retold and repackaged and things like that, you will often find a plot arc. So because we modify these stories to reflect our culture a lot of the times, you might also find that story structure that we are familiar with, like a plot arc. But for folklore, myth, and legend, hero's journey. Always remember the hero's journey. It even sounds like a legend. Our hero is going on a journey. Some common events that might happen in these stories are problem solving. So they have to go solve some sort of problem that is affecting them or affecting their region or affecting their country. So they have to solve that problem. And much of the time there is a lesson learned by the main character. So this is not always the case, but if you're talking about common things that happen in your folklore, myths, and legends, there's some problem solving, and then there's some lessons that are learned. The themes and conflict in our folklore, myth, and legend are, because folklore, myth, and legend is the basis of all of our other art and literature, these will sound familiar to you. So the basic concept is sometimes good versus evil. So that is a theme topic. Again, a theme is a much larger lesson, more of a phrase or a sentence, a complete idea than these shorter ones. These could be topics for themes. So good versus evil, fate or lack of control. So particularly some older cultures really had this idea of fate, that you can't escape your destiny and you shouldn't even try because bad things happen when you do. Nature, so our connection to the natural world or how we understand it, that might be a theme or our lesson. Human nature, so think about fables. They really teach us how we behave. They use those animals and those characteristics like sly fox or grouchy crow or those sorts of things to teach us about our human nature. And again, a common theme or theme topic is that an obvious lesson or moral will be a part of some of the folklore, myth, and legends. That's why they tell it, because they want you to learn this life lesson or think about this moral dilemma. The types of conflict that we frequently see in this kind of literature is character versus fate. Excuse me. Character versus fate. Like you try and escape it and it will come back and get you. A famous example of that would be Oedipus. But if you don't know who he is, you will find out. Character versus nature. So what happens when we try to fight against the forces of nature, as well as character versus self. So those human nature stories, that's really like us learning about ourselves and how sometimes we are our own worst enemies. So again, themes and conflict, very basic beginnings of our literature. Okay, some examples of folklore, myth, and legends, classic examples, and I apologize for the Eurocentric nature of these. I am not as well versed in Eastern, or we should just say non-Western culture at all. My bad. I'll work on it. The classic literature that I've got here is Aesop's Fables. We do know he wrote them as the author, which is unusual. I think that he just did such a wonderful job with it. That's why his name stays attached or got attached to his versions so early on. So Aesop is the author of his fables. Bullfinch's mythology, that is someone who put together all of the mythology. It is the way that many college kids learn about their Greek mythology. So that is a classic if you're going to study that. If you can't, read original Greek or anything like that. Modern books that I have enjoyed or experienced, D'Aulaire's Book of Greek Myths. It's a great primer for the Greek mythology. It's very safe for elementary and middle school children. You guys in high school might be a little bit more mature and more ready for the Bullfinch's versions of some of those myths. Norse mythology, also done by the D'Aulaire's. They do the stories and the drawings. But it just gives you the Norse myths. So we've got Odin and Thor and Sif and Freya and Frigg and all of those stories. So it's another nice version of entry-level mythology for the Norse gods and goddesses. Then there is Anansi the spider, and this is from an African cultures. So Anansi is one of their favorite cultural folktale heroes, and there are many stories about Anansi, and this is a particularly good children's book version that was done forever and a day ago. It's older, but that would be something you could check out to begin to learn some of the same tales from Africa. Movies or TV, I put in here, I'm sure there are many, but La Llorona. La Llorona, there's a weeping woman. She drowns her children. It's a piece of folklore from Mexico, and they have taken it and they've made it into a modern movie. So that is something to consider, that we often steal from folklore, myth, and legend when we're making our movies and television, as well as our books and literature. Some images for me, at least, that seem to stick out, like when I think of this genre, fairy tales. So you can see there's the Pied Piper of Hamelin. There's a lesson in that one. There is many other cultures will have fairy tales that involve animals familiar to them. So I put that in there. The same thing with fairy tales that come to us from the East and the Middle East. Like, you seem to remember, like, the settings, the culture, everything about it would be from that place on Earth. And if that last little one there is Hansel and Gretel, and they are meeting the witch who's going to take them back and feed them so that she can cook them in her oven. But ultimately, she is cooked in her own oven. So these, to me, again, I have a prevailing Western view of folklore, myth, and legend. So I apologize for that. Whew! All right, that was a big, broad genre. But to review, folklore, myth, and legend was first told by storytellers. Right? It was an oral tradition. It was not written down at first, and many, many, many of them have no known author. The phrase that is used is told or retold by. So that is the difference for us between something that would be a folklore fairy tale and a fantasy story, is that a fairy tale won't have a particular author that wrote it at a particular time. It may just have someone that's retelling it from oral history, like the Grimm brothers, or Charles Perrault, or there's one more famous, Hans Christian Andersen. So that's the difference. Folklore, no particular author, would have been a story told out loud and passed on in that way. It often gives the origin or start of something, like in the natural world. So it might tell us how the sun travels across the sky, or how a well or spring came to be where it was. So it helps explain that. It might help create the worldview or explain the worldview of a group of people. So that's how they view nature, how they view human interaction, how they view outsiders. Could also be part of that. Stories that are based on famous figures, places, or events would fit into the legends, and often they just have things that are exaggerated. So maybe the events, they were told that they did way more than is humanly possible, but they're a legend, so of course they could. So the exaggeration might make them stronger, smarter, faster, or more powerful than a human is normally expected to be. Heroes, gods, and animals often have human qualities. In fact, we're supposed to learn from their behavior, so we have to remember that. And then also have a lesson or moral to be learned. So there is some reason that the storyteller chose to create this story. There's a lesson or moral there. So that is our folklore, myth, and legend.